MSW Media.
Spy Talk, a podcast at the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, national security, and military operations.
Hi, I'm Michael Isikoff, and this is Spy Talk.
Breaking news this evening is the identity of the man who sent the Obama administration into defend and explain mode this week. His name is Edward Snowden. He's an American former CIA employee and computer technician. Today, he came out as the leaker of classified NSA documents that spell out a secret surveillance program.
That was CNN's Don Lemon nearly 12 years ago, reporting on the stunning news that a government contractor named Edward Snowden had leaked highly classified documents showing how the National Security Agency conducted surveillance around the world, including secretly monitoring the phone calls of American citizens. The Snowden revelations kicked off enormous debate about the invasions of privacy in the digital age and led to some reforms and limits on how the NSA operated. But it turned out the privacy debate, triggered by the Snowden leaks, barely scratched the surface of what has become a worldwide phenomenon. Advances in technology, pioneered by an Israeli spy agency known as Unit 8200, have spawned a new era of commercial spyware that allows security agencies throughout Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America to target political dissidents and journalists, silently infecting their phones, sucking up all their data, reading their emails and texts, and tracking their movements in ways that far exceed anything Edward Snowden revealed. It's a frightening new technological development that has fostered repression of dissent around the globe and led to a seemingly endless series of political scandals. No one has done more to uncover the extent of spyware surveillance than Ron Deibert. He's not, like Snowden, a government whistleblower, and he hasn't disclosed any secret government documents. Instead, he's an academic who runs something called the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, and he has traced how spyware systems originally developed by Unit 8200, the Israeli version of the NSA, have been commercialized and quietly sold to government spy and law enforcement agencies. Deibert has written a new book just out this week that lays out the dangers of this extremely spooky and still largely unregulated industry. It's called Chasing Shadows, Cyber Espionage, Subversion, and the Global Fight for Democracy. He joins me now on Spy Talk. Ron Deibert, welcome to Spy Talk.
Glad to be here again, Michael, with you. I think I was officially the last guest on your former podcast, Skullduggery.
Skullduggery.
So I hope that's not a bad omen for this podcast.
You're a bridge to the future.
Okay.
I well remember a few years ago I came up to Toronto and talked to you about how you pieced together the story of how Israeli-developed spyware sold to Saudi Arabia played a central role in the targeting and assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It's a truly horrifying story and one that I want to get to in our discussion. But let's just start out. I want to ask you, you're the founder and director of Citizen Lab. Tell us what Citizen Lab is, what you do, and how did you get into the business of tracking and uncovering spyware?
Sure. So the Citizen Lab is a research group at the University of Toronto. I'm the director, so it's technically an academic research lab, but there really is nothing else like it anywhere in the world. The work that we do is quite unorthodox. So when I set out to establish the Citizen Lab, I had an interest in international security issues. I was particularly interested in information technology, especially in the classified areas. And I had an aspiration to draw on some of the methodologies, especially from the technical disciplines, that I thought were very powerful, but were mostly being used in a very conservative way, to reorient those methodologies to lift the lid on the internet, is the way I thought about it. I wanted to document things that I thought were going on in the subterranean realms of cyberspace, especially around government espionage, maybe corporate malfeasance, and bring them to light in the public interest. So the proposal I made for the Citizen Lab, which was way back in the year 2000, was quite literally to create what I envision to be a counterintelligence for civil society. And that means, governments do counterintelligence, even the private sector does counterintelligence, but who's doing counterintelligence for journalists like you, for human rights organizations, for broadly speaking, the public? And I was aware that there was a lot going on. Maybe we could document some of this. And over the years, of course, we've had many successes to the point where, now we're a player in this space, and that's not always necessarily a good thing.
A major player, I should add. Look, in your excellent new book, Chasing Shadows, you write, and this is pretty starkly put, a massive, largely unregulated industry has emerged and proliferated globally that gives government spies the ability to snoop on digital devices anywhere in the world. The latest versions can do so silently, vacuuming up unsuspecting targets' entire private life, following them around, reading their emails, text, and turning on their cameras and microphones. In the introduction to this podcast, I start out by mentioning the huge uproar caused by Edward Snowden's revelations about the NSA 12 years ago. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me what you have uncovered, without stealing any classified documents, by the way,
certainly didn't do that,
no, goes far beyond anything Snowden revealed. Do you agree?
Well, it's a bit apples and oranges, I would say. First of all, what he disclosed, I think obviously many people inside the intelligence agencies were aware of what was going on. General public maybe less so. People who are specialized in the area, who had knowledge of classified programs in the United States, probably had good suspicions. And so when the revelations came out, there were a lot of interesting details, but it was kind of like, well, we may expect that. It's something that they do, that organizations like the NSA should do. And of course, a lot of it was already popularized in cinematic films like Enemy of the State and so forth. So although shocking, it was something that I think people were kind of familiar with. What we uncovered was a market for sophisticated signals intelligence technologies that had emerged and was being provided to governments that lacked those type of in-house capabilities, either on the human resource side, they just don't have a lot of talented personnel, or on the technical side. So effectively, this is creating an off-the-shelf NSA for governments around the world. And of course, if you look around the world at the nature of governments, the unfortunate reality is most of them are not democracies. Most of them have almost no oversight over their intelligence agencies. And as a consequence, not surprising, you're going to see a lot of abuses. And that's at least part of the story of the work that the Citizen Lab has been doing over the last 20 years.
I mean, my point on this is Snowden, by stealing government documents, did reveal NSA surveillance of Americans. But what you revealed is much more sinister, which is the abuse of surveillance by multiple governments around the world, targeting journalists, targeting political dissidents. And that seems to me much more frightening.
Well, I think there would be many people who would look at the Snowden disclosures and say there's evidence of abuse there. And there were legal reforms afterwards, so I wouldn't say there was no abuse.
Evidence of snooping and per se, but not, as far as I know, evidence of it being misused to target political enemies or journalists or anything, or human rights activists, anything like that.
Whereas what we have uncovered is actually the norm for that sort of thing. So what we are seeing is a bonanza of abuses among governments that I would also underline include liberal democratic governments like Mexico, Spain, Hungary, Greece, going after political opposition, going after journalists who are investigating abuse of power. So just really unvarnished abuses, if you will, in a really shocking manner. And then there's the technology itself. So within the Snowden disclosures, you had a lot of surveillance that was based on accessing major tech platforms, which of course is very powerful in and of itself. If you can tap into Facebook and telecommunications companies, you can get a lot. There was some detail on phone hacking in the Snowden disclosures, but those disclosures related to activities that were going on really prior to the industry that we have been focusing on emerging. And that industry, of course, has its roots in Western European innovations, as well as companies coming out of Israel that include some of the most highly trained engineers, people who worked for Unit 8200 and are applying their skills to the commercial marketplace to get inside people's devices, which provides extraordinary, almost godlike visibility into a person's day-to-day life. So,
well, you anticipated my very next question, which is, a lot of your cases, maybe most, lead you back to Israel, and in particular, the role of, you just mentioned it, Unit 8200, I'm sorry, 8200, the Israeli version of the NSA, correct, which I didn't realize was founded as long ago as 1952. Yeah. But you say its agents and analysts were taught to think outside the box, and that it served as a training ground for the nation's most skilled hackers and computer engineers. Tell us about Unit 8200 and why it was so important to the creation of this commercial spyware industry.
Well, it is a very interesting story. I mean, part of it has to do with the historical context of the Israeli state being founded amidst a sea of enemies who are bent on its destruction, and having to place a priority on intelligence gathering, both domestically and especially abroad. And, maybe as almost an accident of history, prioritizing computer security and computerized methods of intelligence gathering, maybe partially as a function of the fact that you had a lot of highly skilled mathematicians and engineers coming as Russian emigres, and then some, far-sighted strategic decisions to set up a unit that would specialize in this area. But I think the key factor was a conscientious decision to encourage commercialization. So unlike in the United States, in Israel, veterans of those agencies are actually supported and encouraged by the state, both directly and indirectly, to take their skills and actually create startups, which is precisely why when you look at the surveillance marketplace, Israeli firms dominate. I would add, though, that it's not just Israeli firms. In fact, what we are seeing is a proliferation of this technology to the Gulf. There's a migration to Europe as well. So the marketplace is broadening beyond Israel. But for sure, there's an Israeli story here, and it has to do with the history and institutional circumstances of Israeli intelligence.
By the way, this does lead me to a question I've been wondering about for, the last year and a half, which is, how is it that the Israelis, which have developed the most sophisticated advanced surveillance systems in the world, and yet they were completely blind to the fact that Hamas in Gaza on their border were planning a major attack on their country?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think we won't find out the full answer to it until there's a proper postmortem done on what happened on October 7th and leading up to it. I wouldn't say that they were completely blind, because at least what I have read and understand is that there were people within Israeli intelligence that were monitoring Hamas, that were trying to raise alarm bells, and also that Israeli allied countries, including the United States and Egypt, were passing along intelligence saying something big was about to happen. So it looks to be that this was, at least in part, a human failure, kind of like 9/11, where the technology, the equipment, the resources were there, but they weren't situated in a way to anticipate this. Let's not forget that the Netanyahu administration itself is riven with corruption, was distracted prior to October 7th with mass street protests having to do with his attempts to politicize the judiciary and effectively neuter them. So there are a lot of organizational reasons that might explain the failure rather than technical ones.
Although it also does suggest, perhaps, that the bad guys who we want surveillance to be scooping up intelligence from have kind of learned their lesson, know their adversaries, and know how to communicate without in any way having those communications intercepted. That seems to be what Sinwar and company in Gaza have done. But
True.
But let's just to complete the circle on the Israeli part of the story, former people at 8200, the Israeli agency, then go into business. As you said, it becomes commercialized, and you get this company that plays a big role in your investigations, the NSO Group. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the Khashoggi story, which I mentioned before, which is how I first learned about their work, and walk us through how you were able to trace the role of the NSO Group in what ultimately became the assassination of Khashoggi. And as I recall, it starts with a Saudi dissident in Canada called Omar Abdulaziz.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
Take the story from there.
Well, to truly understand the story, you have to go back a couple of years, actually, to 2016. And this was, I would say, in the early days of the Citizen Lab studying the mercenary spyware industry. We received out of the blue 2 text messages from a Emirati dissident named Ahmad Mansour. And they contained links to NSO Group exploits. Had he clicked on those links, they would have infected his phone with Pegasus spyware. Instead of clicking on them, he forwarded them to us for analysis.
And Pegasus spyware is the
NSO Group's flagship spyware product. That's right. And the way this works is there are exploits that are quite precious and rare, and they change. They are the tools that are used to pry open a phone, and they depend on analysts, engineers, either developing or purchasing themselves knowledge of vulnerabilities that they can take advantage of operating systems on phones or applications to get inside a phone. Once they pry that phone open, then they will insert Pegasus. So Pegasus is like the the Microsoft Word, if you will. It's the tool that doesn't change much, that's used for the spying, but you need the exploits to get inside the device. In any event, we were forwarded these links, and our team, led by the brilliant sleuth Bill Marzak, infected one of our own phones in a laboratory environment. That enabled us to capture Pegasus spyware and the exploits that they were using. And what we did at that point in 2016 is begin a process of network mapping. So if you think about how spyware works, it infects a phone. In order to extract data from that phone, from a target, it has to move across the internet to command and control servers that are used to gather information or send commands back to an infected device. Those leave trails. Those have signatures in terms of how they communicate over the internet. So we literally mapped the entire internet looking for the command and control servers of NSO Group's infrastructure. And we started to get refined to the point where we could detail where, in fact, Pegasus infections were occurring around the world. And one of those infections we could see was from a device in Canada, which, of course, is in our backyard. We were very curious. We knew nothing more than the IP address of the phone and the fact that it was coming from a couple of internet service providers in the Quebec province of Canada. So our team literally went out knocking on doors. We knew this was a Saudi operator. We could see that much. We knew it was a device in Canada. We hypothesized it would be an activist or a dissident of interest to the Saudi regime. And so we drew up a short list and simply went knocking on doors, literally asking people if we could, with their consent, examine their phones. When we came across Omar Abdulaziz. He was already a pretty prominent activist. He had a high-profile YouTube channel where he criticized Mohammed bin Salman. And we took a look at his phone and discovered a match. There was a text message he received that contained an NSO group exploit link. And furthermore, his pattern of life, his movements, matched exactly what we could see on the network measurement side. So we had a positive match. We published our report on October 1st, 2018. The very next day, I got a text message from Omar Abdulaziz saying, "Oh my God, I'm worried Jamal has gone missing." And up until that point in time, I had no idea he was even a confidant or friend of Jamal Khashoggi. So the very day after we published our report, Jamal went missing. And we learned that they had been in close communication over many, many months using WhatsApp, thinking that this would protect the confidentiality of their communications. They were organizing things that in the eyes of Saudi intelligence would be seen as very provocative, traitorous type of things, which simply amount to pushing for greater transparency and democracy. But for a regime like that, that's considered a major threat.
And resisting and challenging Saudi bots and sock puppets on Twitter, yes. Which was, yeah.
Yeah, and as it turned out, not only was it Omar Abdulaziz's phone was hacked, as I relay in Chasing Shadows, we were able to determine that essentially the entire circle around Jamal Khashoggi had their phones hacked by Saudi Arabia using Pegasus spyware, including, by the way, Ben Hubbard, a New York Times journalist, who, interesting sidebar story, he received the same text message that Omar Abdulaziz received, showing that he had been targeted with Pegasus spyware around the same time frame as Omar Abdulaziz was. We published a report about that, and he went to NSO Group for comment. They swore up and down Citizen Lab was wrong. This is impossible. There's no way that we would allow a client to hack a New York Times journalist's phone. A little while later, we developed more refined forensic techniques, which allowed us to look deeper inside a phone, including going back in time. And we discovered proof positive that his phone was hacked at precisely the very time that NSO Group was claiming that the Citizen Lab was wrong. So it just goes to show that the net that was cast around Jamal Khashoggi was very wide. We don't know what happened to his own devices. His fiancée had them when he went into the consulate, and she turned them over to Turkish intelligence where they remain. But I suspect that those are hacked as well.
I mean, is it clear to you that the targeting and the infection of the phone of Omar Abdulaziz in Canada led the Saudis and the team of assassins dispatched by the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, that's how it came about? I
don't think you could make that inference. I mean, we don't know what decision-making was going on behind the scenes in Saudi Arabia. What precipitated the decision to assassinate this person, to murder them in such a gruesome way? There could be many factors related to it, many things Khashoggi did that would irritate the regime.
I'm just talking about because they had complete visibility to Omar Abdulaziz's phone and all his communications with Khashoggi, it would have allowed them to track Khashoggi's movements
100%.
at all times.
100%. Right. And also his wife's phone, his fiance's phone,
right, and
his friends' phones, his colleagues' phones, all hacked.
And the NSO Group, when asked about this, insists it had no role whatsoever in the murder of Khashoggi.
They denied it several times, which is implausible and contrary to the evidence.
Right. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Ron Deibert about some of his other amazing investigations, including some in Europe, which led to what he says is a flood of Watergates. So we are back with Ron Deibert of Citizen Lab. We've been talking about the very critical role that the Israeli firm NSO Group and other spin-offs from Unit 8200 have had. But it's not just Israelis that are involved in this shady business of spyware. And actually, you tell a story about a former U.S. NSA analyst who actually was a supervisor for Edward Snowden, who then herself goes off to the United Arab Emirates and becomes involved in a spyware scheme called Project Raven. I'm talking about Laurie Stroud, who you write about in the book. Tell us about that story and how you got involved.
Yeah, this is a wild story. So, I mentioned before our investigations in 2016 that led to NSO Group involved a dissident in the United Arab Emirates named Ahmad Mansour, who shared text messages with us. We had done an investigation on UAE-based cyber espionage using a variety of tools and targeting a wide cross-section of people. And we gave a code name to the operator called Stealth Falcon, because we couldn't attribute, we didn't have enough evidence to say confidently who exactly was doing this. And the report was very thorough, but around the time it was published, I got an email out of the blue from someone claiming to be associated with what we labeled Stealth Falcon. And I'm slightly embarrassed to say that I largely ignored it. I think I forwarded it on to my colleague Bill Marzak. He might have replied, he can't remember. Fact of the matter is we get a deluge of emails like this, and it's very difficult to discern what is real or not, or what is worth pursuing, because, a lot of it comes from people with mental health issues and so on, paranoid people, conspiracy-minded people. In any event, shortly afterwards, Christopher Bing and Joel Sheckman at Reuters did a profile of a project in the UAE called Project Raven that included former NSA contractors, one of which was this person who had emailed us. So after reading that story, I reached out to her and found out about the operation that we had been tracking and uncovering. And it turned out that this was an entity in the UAE which was involved in cyber espionage and spyware targeting of the sort that we're describing, that included quite a significant number of American personnel, ex-CIA, ex-NSA contractors. Laurie Stroud, as you mentioned, worked with Edward Snowden in Hawaii as part of NSA's facilities there, as well as her husband, Jonathan Cole. And they both, after the Snowden disclosures came out, they were looking for new opportunities, were attracted to the mission in the Gulf. High salaries, tax-free zones, interesting opportunities using a lot of fancy tools. She became disgruntled and eventually left the organization when the management turned over from an American company that the Emiratis were subcontracting to a local one called Dark Matter. And she eventually became a whistleblower. And as a consequence of her whistleblowing, 3 U.S. citizens were given deferred prosecution agreements. They were charged with violating essentially non-disclosure requirements of NSA personnel. You're just not allowed to take that stuff that you've learned, all your trade secrets, and deploy them in this way. So for us, it was wild to see this entity that we were investigating that we could only imagine. It's often the case when you're doing these investigations, you can tell definitively okay, this tool was used to do the spying. If I look at Omar Abdulaziz's phone, I can say with certainty that it's Pegasus spyware. So it's equivalent to being a murder investigator, and you can say, well, this bullet was used to do the murder, and I can say it was this gun, but who pulled the trigger? It's often difficult. You usually have just circumstantial evidence. Here we had detailed information, not only on the operation itself, but the very layout of the building where they undertook the hacking. So it was quite an insight into what was on the other side of our investigations.
And this is a UAE company or
Dark Matter. Originally, it was a U.S. subcontractor. Cyberpoint was doing the hacking, but the Emiratis essentially localized it. And Dark Matter
are they
is now
using American technology or Israeli technology, or where did the UAE folks get the software malware to do this?
It appears to be they were using a whole variety of spyware and exploits. So they would have to develop exploits for particular targets' phones. In order to do that, they would have ex-NSA contractors help with the analysis and the operational targeting. So, for example, if they wanted to go after you, Michael Isikoff, they'd want to know, well, what phone is he using? What is the operating system and all of that? So there's a lot of reconnaissance that goes into the targeting. And then, yes, they would go out and they would buy Israeli exploits or procure spyware from Israeli or other firms, or possibly develop it in-house. We don't know everything that they're doing, of course, because a lot of it is shrouded in secrecy.
But certainly having the assistance of ex-spooks like Laurie Stroud would have been enormously helpful, which does get to one of the really interesting points you make in the book. Most people are aware of the worldwide market for mercenary armies and mercenaries, but only a few know about the market for mercenary spooks from the CIA, Mossad, KGB. This is a whole network that has really been flourishing in recent years.
What's really interesting about it is if you look at the world of covert operations, from subversion to sabotage, even to assassination and so forth, all of those things that we usually think of that governments are doing in the clandestine realm is all now pretty much commercialized and available in the marketplace. So, and it's very lucrative business. What concerns me greatly is that a lot of this is being deployed not just by governments, which is bad enough when you look at the roster of despots and authoritarian regimes out there, but to private corporations as well. So, using private investigators, as you well know, is not new. That's been going on for many, many decades. But using private intelligence firms that have access to these very specialized surveillance technologies and also disinformation technologies now, disinformation for hire is becoming a big business. And the way I think about it is dark PR, so public relations type activities, but which are used to smear people, discredit them, undermine their reputation.
What's an example of that?
Well, we experienced that. There is a story I tell in the book shortly after our publication on Omar Abdulaziz. My staff was targeted by a covert operation that we eventually exposed in a sting. And it turned out that that operation was managed by a company called Black Cube, which was made up of ex-Mossad agents. Same company that went after those who allege sexual abuse against Harvey Weinstein.
Right. That is, I did read that chapter, and it's amusing how you did your own counter sting of a Black Cube operator, invited in a journalist, Raphael Satter, and had him confront the Black Cube guy while he was posing as somebody else talking to one of your investigators. But I want to get to
Michael, can I just pause on that? Because
yeah.
On the face of it, it's a humorous story, and we did a great job. We exposed this bumbling spy. But I can tell you being on the other side of it is alarming. It's very upsetting. You start second guessing everything around you when you suddenly realize for months, well-trained operatives of this sort have been focused on you and your organization to try to uncover anything that they can use to try to discredit you. It really shakes you. And I say this as somebody who also speaks to a lot of victims of this type of targeted attack. It can be emotionally incredibly draining, to the point where people become so afraid they don't want to do their job anymore. I think a reasonable person in my position might have said, you know what, this is getting too serious. We're getting successful to the point where these really bad actors are coming after us. Maybe we should shut the whole thing down. And that may be part of the intent. It's certainly a very useful effect for those on the other side. And I think this type of thing is likely going to become more widely used in the future, given the nature of the market that we're talking about. It's almost entirely unregulated. And of course, the tone that is being set in the United States with the incoming Trump administration, operating with a kind of impunity and condoning this type of behavior. I really worry for investigative journalists and for digital watchdog groups like mine.
I want to get to that in a moment, but before we do, I want to just talk at least a little about my favorite chapter in the book. It's the one towards the end, Europe flooded with Watergates.
Yes.
And you tell some amazing stories. I mean, we've talked about Saudi Arabia, UAE, not exactly beacons of human rights, but these are countries where there have been multiple scandals, democratic European countries that have purchased this kind of spyware and used it to target journalists, human rights activists, political dissidents. You start off in, of all places, Greece, where a financial journalist by the name of Thanasis Koukakis is working on stories about a banking scandal. Yes. And then he discovers that somebody is snooping and intercepting his conversations. He gets handed from a source a transcript of a conversation he had with a colleague on his cell phone while he was waiting to pick up his daughter from school.
Yeah.
And just one more beat, which I love. He files a complaint with a government agency for security and privacy, and he gets back a response that says no event was found to be a violation of law.
Yeah.
And of course,
they changed the law.
They had just changed the law to forbid disclosure of any information to any target of surveillance. Sounds like a classic catch-22.
Yeah, wow, what can you say about that case? Because also it turns out that there was a lot of malfeasance at the highest levels. First of all, I should say, after our report was released, we routinely publish technical indicators when we do reports of this sort. And the hope there is that you're giving other people the data that they can use to check for themselves. And in this case, that's precisely what happened. After we published the report on Thanasis Koukakis and other reports on, this is a different spyware called Predator, manufactured by a firm called Citrox, which is part of a consortium of surveillance companies, the so-called Star Alliance of surveillance companies called Intellexa, also made up of former Israeli intelligence officers, by the way. When we published those indicators, a Greek MEP, a member of European Parliament, looked at the report and said, you know what, maybe I should check my phone. And he discovered his phone had been hacked with Predator. It set off a scandal in Greece, and the head of Greek intelligence resigned. That was the second head of intelligence sacked as a consequence of either directly or indirectly Citizen Lab reporting. The other was in Spain with respect to our Catalan Gate investigation, where the head of intelligence there was sacked. But investigations that were done after our report came out by investigative journalists in Greece showed that there was all sorts of corruption and malfeasance surrounding the prime minister. and business dealings with shady people involved in Intellexa. So not only did you have surveillance of political opposition and investigative journalists in Greece, you had corruption involving the business entities that were whose services were being procured by the government. So it was really a mess overall, I would say. Unfortunately, the prime minister survived that scandal unscathed and actually won a majority in the next election, which is a little bit depressing. I know for people like Thanasis Koukakis, for example, who was spied on in this way, it was just discouraging beyond belief that the scandal didn't precipitate something more consequential.
Well, we certainly have seen in the United States how scandals don't necessarily end political careers
yes,
of
right.
Politicians. So look, you have, identified in multiple instances really gross abuses of these systems. But I watched the recent Ronan Farrow documentary, which he was given access to the NSO group in Israel, and they make the point, as they have all along, that look, we license our our product to countries that tell us they're going to use them for legitimate counterterrorism and law enforcement purposes, getting bad guys, getting child pornographers, getting terrorists, getting other crooks. Do they have a point that, there are legitimate uses for technology of this kind, which, we want governments to have?
Well, I don't know if they have a point, but there are people who do have a point along those lines, and that would be largely people who work in law enforcement and intelligence. The reality is the world is a nasty place, and there are a lot of bad people in the world. We want our world to be safe, and we want our law enforcement agencies to be well equipped. There are some people in my community, broadly speaking, that think, and I think they make a good argument here, that this technology is so invasive. The type of information you can gather from a person's phone is so overbroad. There's no minimization that's possible here because you're gathering not only information about the target, but information on everyone they're communicating with as well, that it should be banned. I'm not certain about that. I think that, first of all, a ban is unrealistic. Secondly, I think there are defensible reasons that governments should be equipped with surveillance technologies, whether of this sort or another sort, to do their job. That's not the issue. The issue is that two things. The companies that are manufacturing this technology are essentially wiping their hands of all responsibility, which I think is wrong and indefensible. It's morally objectionable that a company like NSO Group would not only sell to a Saudi regime, where there's a high likelihood they'll use it for abuse, but did so repeatedly even after the revelations that we published came to light. That's just wrong. Secondly, in a lot of countries around the world, you have nothing like proper oversight. There's no independent body that's watching to prevent abuses. So it's less about the technology and whether it should be used or not, in my view, than it should be used with proper checks and balances, and in most of the world, that's largely absent. I would say it's the same here in Canada. Recently, our law enforcement almost inadvertently disclosed that they had been using spyware of this sort in their criminal investigations for over a decade without informing our privacy commissioner or undergoing the proper privacy assessments. That's just wrong. We should have better checks and balances in place. That's ultimately, I think, the intent of the research that we're doing, is to show, hey, unless there are guardrails around this, there are going to be an awful lot of cases of journalists like you, human rights defenders, political opposition, having their phones snooped on in ways that are going to cause enormous harm, either to those individuals or to political institutions, and we better wake up to that fact.
Well, let's wrap up by talking about those guardrails, because thanks in large part to the work you've done. The Biden administration did take some steps. There was an executive order that I believe restricted the use of this sort of spyware by U.S. government agencies, and also another move to deny visas to individuals who were involved in spyware. Has the U.S. government done enough in this area? And you raised some concerns before about what the Trump administration might do, so please incorporate that into your answer.
Well, we saw remarkable progress coming out of the United States on this file, not just because of the work of the Citizen Lab, but because of a community really of researchers and advocates, including groups like Amnesty International, Access Now, raising the points that we've been talking about and advocating in all the right places that something needed to be done. And it was astonishing to me, frankly, to see the executive order come out in language that frankly would be something that I might write. And as an aside, I'd say as a political scientist, to have the President of the United States sign an executive order on a topic that you care about is kind of like capturing the Holy Grail. So it was a big accomplishment. And then there are all the other things that you talk about, sanctions, visa restrictions. Eventually 21 countries pledged to support the same initiative as the United States. So there was a lot of momentum happening. And I think it really hurt the industry. NSO Group's valuation dropped by about $1 billion after they were sanctioned, for example. So things were looking pretty bright until, of course, the election and the Trump administration. We don't know where all of that stands now. Fortunately, within his flurry of executive orders, including those repealing Biden's executive orders, these were not included. So far they remain untouched. But I have big worries because, first of all, the posture of this administration, asserting unchecked executive power, secrecy around organizations, basically taking a hacksaw to oversight agencies, its close alliance with Israel, collusion with Gulf autocratic countries, all the things, all the contextual factors here seem to point towards those regulations now being on thin ice. And that worries me greatly.
At least the nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had her confirmation hearing today. It's not clear whether she is going to make it through and get confirmed, but she is one who has expressed concerns about privacy violations.
Yeah, although on the other hand, you have somebody right now, Kash Patel for FBI.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't give me a lot of assurance that we're going to have responsible people and presiding over these very powerful agencies that will want to procure this stuff, right, and will not care about the concerns groups like ours are raising. I would say as a last thing, though, maybe there's an argument to be said that, look, this is as much a national security issue as a human rights issue. Having read the book, you'll know that we identified hacked devices on senior government officials at the highest level, including a phone in 10 Downing Street. So an unregulated, proliferating market for mercenary surveillance technology is not good for anyone's national security.
I don't think there are too many people that would disagree with that. Ron Deibert, I want to thank you. Once again, the book is Chasing Shadows, Cyber Espionage, Subversion, and the Global Fight for Democracy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Michael. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
And that's it for this week's Spy Talk. Be sure to check out our complete podcast archive on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't already, do check out the spytalk.co news site on Substack, where we offer a steady diet of scoops and original analyses on the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, and military operations. Just Google Spy Talk and you'll quickly find your way there. This edition of the Spy Talk podcast was smoothly produced, as always, by Kanai and expertly edited by Molly Hockey for MSW Media. That's it. See you around. I'm Michael Isikoff. Thanks for listening.
For more original reporting and insights like this, subscribe to spytalk.co on Substack and follow us on Twitter at @talk_spy. If you enjoyed our podcast, subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
MSW Media.